Good morning, year four. Another cold one today. -3, it says in my car this morning. -3. So, really cold. Hat. Maybe some stories of life in Australia might warm us up. But it's probably good that you're doing your learning from home. You can stay nice and warm. Anyway, we had a good day, didn't we, with the boys yesterday? They found a new home for themselves. They seem very happy, which is really good. So, let's hear more about their story. Scrambled eggs and baked beans. We'd been living at the Ark for about 4 or 5 years when Auntie Megs had her accident. Marty and I had been swimming in the river. We did that most days when the weather was right, if there was enough water in the river. Swimming was something else Auntie Megs had taught us. Almost as important as poetry, she'd said. Best exercise there is, and it could save your life one day too. We came wandering back up to the house, but when we called for Auntie Megs, she wasn't there. A quick look at the empty compound told us what she was doing and where she was. She'd gone off on one of her rides into the bush, hoping to release some of her little fellows, her family of animals. Normally she'd be gone for about an hour or two, no more, but after several hours there was still no sign of her. We decided we shouldn't wait any longer and we should go out looking for her. I was leading Big Black Jack out of the paddock when we saw her horse come galloping riderless down the track from the hills. We didn't waste any time then, but rode back up the way her horse had come, calling for Auntie Megs as we went. We knew roughly where it was that she usually went to release her animals, the same area she'd found us all those years before. So that's where we were heading now, both of us on Big Black Jack, Auntie Meg's horse following along behind. After a while, we heard her singing out loud. Later she told us the singing helped her take her mind off the pain. We found her out in the open beyond the trees, sitting with her back up against a rock, her family of animals scattered all around her. She was holding her arm tight to her chest and had a nasty gash down one side of her face. There was so much blood all over her. Her shirt was soaked with it, both hands and her neck. She smiled up at us. "Am I glad to see you?" she said. "Don't worry about the blood. Got plenty more where that came from. Just get me up and take me home, there's good boys." She was already too weak to walk very far, so we knew that somehow we had to get her on the horse. It wasn't at all easy. We had to find the right tree stump to use as a mounting block, then help her up into the saddle. I could see her shoulder was paining her dreadfully. I led the way on Big Black Jack while Marty rode up behind Auntie Megs, holding her steady in the saddle all the way home. Then I rode on into town for the doctor. It turned out she needed a dozen stitches in her face and that she'd broken her collarbone. He put a sling on her and told her also that she'd lost a lot of blood and had to rest up for a while. A month at least, maybe more. "Phooey," she said. The doctor stood there then, wagging his finger. "Don't you phooey me, Megs Malloy," he told her. "This is serious. You're to keep that sling on and stay still. These boys of yours will look after you. You stay put, you hear me? Doctor's orders." And then he turned to us. "And if she tries to get up and go off looking for her little animals, you have my permission to lock her in." I think he was only partly joking. Marty and I took him at his word. Now we were looking after Auntie Megs, which made a change. We made a deal with her. "You tell us what to do and we'll do it," we said. But she had to stay put, stay still, rest as the doctor had told her. She agreed, reluctantly. So that's what happened. She only had to tell us what to do for a few days until we got into some kind of routine. After that, we just got on with it. We took turns at everything we didn't much like doing, which was mostly the cooking and the washing up and the laundry. Auntie Megs taught me from her sofa how to make scrambled egg on toast. She was very detailed and specific in her instructions. She allowed no deviation. Beat the eggs, bits of salt, bits of pepper, some milk. You had to spread the butter on the toast, keep it warm. Then you cooked the eggs, and the eggs had to be cooked just right, not for too long or they'd go all lumpy and tasteless. I did it better than Marty, who always forgot the toast and burnt it. I still cook the meanest scrambled eggs in the world, all these years later, and it's still my favourite meal. During Auntie Meg's convalescence, scrambled eggs alternated regularly with baked beans, or bubble and squeak, or corned beef hash, and we could fry bacon too. Poor Auntie Meg's, thinking back, it wasn't the best diet for a patient. But she never grumbled, she laughed about it instead and told us the nicest possible way that neither of us should ever take up a career in catering. Outside though, Marty and I really came into our own. We did everything that Auntie Meg's had done. There was no time any more for swimming or fishing or climbing trees. Most mornings we'd go off, as she had done, up to the main road, searching for any surviving orphans. We fed those we had in the compound, and every so often we rode off into the bush, the animal cavalcade following behind, hoping one or two might stay up there. We milked the cows and the goats, fed the hens, took pot shots with Auntie Meg's gun at any dingoes that came too close. We even learned to be brave with the geese and to keep Henry out of the house. We were only partially successful in that, but we learnt to cope, and, to be honest, we liked it, every moment of it, even the laundry and the shopping. We'd ride off once a week into town, one of us on Big Black Jack, the other on Auntie Meg's horse. We took it in turns to ride Big Black Jack because neither of us much like Auntie Meg's horse. He was easily spooked. A bit nervous too, and not only by the kangaroos either, but by just about everything. Whenever I rode him into town I felt the same as he did, always on edge, always twitchy. I could never forget that it was his fault Auntie Meg's was lying there with a broken collarbone. He'd heard something rustling in the trees, she told us, and he'd reared up in sudden terror. That's how it happened. I could never forget that, so I could never trust him. Then there were the visitors who came to call, usually for tea. Auntie Meg's didn't like the visits any more than we did. She swore she'd never fall off a horse again, nor ever get ill. It wasn't that she didn't like people, she did, but the trouble was they clearly liked her more than she liked them. Now she was incapacitated, they came visiting all too often, and there was nothing much she could do about it. When the vicar turned up, she didn't like it one bit, and didn't trouble to hide her feelings either. I was there when he came. She was pretty blunt with him. "I'm not at death's door yet," she told him. "Just broken a collarbone, that's all. No need for those last rites." He wasn't amused and went off quite quickly after that. And Marty and I didn't like the intrusion of 3 visitors much either. We felt that some of them were checking up to see if we were looking after her properly. They'd bring baskets of food, and all of them, without exception, would ask if there was anything they could do to help. We loved it when Auntie Meg's told them that her boys were looking after her wonderfully and everything was just fine. It was about this time, though, that I first began to notice a change in Marty. He'd grown up quite a lot recently. He'd always been a lot taller than me, but now he seemed much older. Until now I'd hardly noticed the 4-year difference between us, but I did now. He was becoming the man of the house. Marty would sit with Auntie Meg's for hours on end listening to the stories of how her family and Mix had come over to Australia from Ireland a century before, driven out by the potato famine, she said. They had found this valley and settled there. Marty loved looking through Auntie Meg's photos albums with her too. He wanted to hear about Mick in particular, and she loved to talk about him. I remember sitting there watching them and feeling a little jealous of Marty for the first time. He seemed to be able to talk to her in a way that I couldn't. He wasn't just one of her boys, he was becoming more of a friend. And she still treated me more like a boy, like a child. Up to now, it had been fine, but suddenly it wasn't. Sometimes I couldn't bear to sit there and watch them, and I'd go off to bed early. It made me feel very alone again. I'd sulk about it from time to time, but with Marty, I could never sulk for long. He wouldn't let you. One way or another he talked me round, get me smiling again. Once we were alone in our room at night, he would be the same old Marty again. We'd share our deepest secrets in the dark. We'd talk into the early mornings sometimes. It was during one of those long nights that Marty told me his worst fear, which then became my worst fear too. "Do you know what I think, Arthur?" he said. "Sometimes I think this is our real home, that we really are her children, that we'll be able to stay here forever. Then I think, but we're not her children, are we? We're like her family of animals out there, her little fellows, her orphans. We're orphans too, aren't we? She hasn't said anything, but sometimes I think she wants us to go, just like she wants them to go. That boy in the photo with Mick, he's her real son. She won't say anything about him, but he must have gone. And when he went, he didn't come back, did he? But I don't want to go, not ever. I feel like I'm part of her proper family, that you're my brother, that Mick's my real father too. I'm going to be just like him one day, I am." Then he added, "You still got your lucky key of yours, haven't you?" I had. I didn't wear it anymore, maybe because I thought I didn't need to. For some time I'd been keeping it in the drawer in my bedside table. I'd look at it from time to time, but it no longer seemed quite important to me as it had been at Cooper Station. I must have thought that I couldn't get any luckier anyway, so I just didn't need it anymore. As for the cross Piggy Bacon had made us wear, I must have lost it, but I can't remember how or where. Marty chucked it in the river one day, and I wondered then if he was throwing away his luck, our luck, From that night on, I couldn't get out of my head what Marty had said about Auntie Meg's wanting us to leave one day. When we were alone, the two of us talked about nothing else. We decided to wait until Auntie Meg's was up and about again, and then we'd ask her. But even after her shoulder was better and things were back to normal and she was doing the cooking and we were eating something besides scrambled eggs and baked beans, we still kept putting it off. In the end, we put it off for good. The truth is, I think, that neither of us really wanted to know the answer because we feared too much what it might be. It was to be another couple of years before we found out, and then we didn't have to ask her. Auntie Meg's wasn't one to beat about the bush. When she told us straight. Next chapter. You're my boys, aren't you? Auntie Meg's had been quiet for a few days. She was like that. There'd be times when she seemed very preoccupied. She wouldn't sing. She'd sit alone on the veranda and read her poetry. She'd go for long rides. Marty said it was because she was missing Mick. And it was true that when his birthday came round, or the anniversary of his death, that's where she was most noticeably quiet. But this time, there was a difference. There was a nervousness about her we'd never seen before. It was almost as if she was avoiding us. In retrospect, of course, we should have guessed what was coming, but we didn't. I put it down to Henry. Henry had gone missing a couple of days before. We weren't that worried because Henry was almost going off on walkabouts into the bush, sometimes for a few hours, sometimes for a few days, but he'd always come back. I'd just been outside to see if he was down his hole. I came in for supper, and I was washing my hands at the sink. "He's not back, Auntie," I said. "Well, maybe he's gone for good this time," Auntie Meg's was serving up as she talked. "Maybe Henry's finally decided it's the right time for him to go. About time too, I'd say." She took a deep breath before she spoke again. "Well, I reckon this is a good time as any to tell you boys." "Tell us what?" I asked, sitting down at the table. My plate was piled high in front of me with tatty pie, Auntie Meg's meat and potato pie with crusty pastry. I was longing to get at it, but we always had to wait till everyone was served. Auntie Meg's was very strict about things like that. "I've been writing letters," she went on, "to a friend of mine in Sydney, an old friend of Mick's from the Navy, Freddie Dodds. It's taken a while, but now it's all set up." Up until now, she hadn't been looking at us, but now she was. "I decided to wait until you were both old enough, till you were both ready, and now I reckon you are. Freddie says you can start work in a couple of weeks' time." My appetite for tatty pie had suddenly gone. Now we knew. Our worst fears were about to be realized. "Freddie Dodds runs a boatyard. Makes boats just like we do in the shed, only bigger of course, the real thing. He wants to take you on as apprentices. It's all fixed up. A proper paid job, in the yard, and a place for you to live." While she was talking, Henry nudged the door open and came in. None of us paid him any attention. "I'm not going to ask you what you think," Auntie Meg said, "but I'm going to tell you why I'm doing this. If I've learnt anything in life, I've learnt that you can't cling on. After Mick died, after I did my crying, I had to let go. With all those animals out there in the compound, I mustn't hang on to them. They're not mine. They have a life to live out there, and you're not mine either. I have to let you go. You have to live a life." Marty was on his feet, upset like I'd never seen him before. "But we're not dead, and we're not a couple of Joeys either. This place, it's our home. I don't want to go to Sydney. I don't want to go at all." Auntie Meg went to him then, and put her arms round him and held him. "Do you think I want you to go?" she said. "Do you think I want to be here on my own? You're my boys, aren't you? The Ark is your home. It always will be. It'll be here for you whenever you want to come back, and I'll be here too. I'm your mother, aren't I?" She turned to me then. "Don't just sit there. Come and give your old mother a hug too." The hugging helped stem the tears after a while, but then the numbing reality set in. We were going. In a couple of weeks we'd be leaving home, leaving Auntie Meg's. We lived out those weeks as if every day was our last. They passed in a blur of riding and fishing and swimming. We groomed Big Black Jack every day till his coat glistened as never before. Henry was fed his bottle several times a day, spoiled rotten even more than usual, and all the while Auntie Meg's was growing quieter and quieter. We so hoped she would weaken and let us stay, but she remained resolute. Every night she was darning or mending something. She couldn't have her boys going to Sydney looking like a couple of raggedy scarecrows, she said. And while she was doing it, and because we knew she loved us to do it, we recited poems for her. Marty did the yarn of the Nancy Bell, always his favourite because it had a rhythm and a gruesome twist to it at the end, which we all loved. And I do my party piece, The Ancient Mariner. The last time I did it, she looked up at me and said, "Thank you, Arthur dear, I shan't forget it." I haven't forgotten it either. She came into our room on the last evening and put a book in each of our suitcases. Mine was The Rime of the Ancient Mariner, Marty's The Yarn of the Nancy Bell. I have them by me now, as I am writing this. They're still my most treasured books. Out of a leather shoelace I made a new tie for my lucky key that night and hung it around my neck. I wasn't at all sure I really believed in this kind of thing anymore. At 15 it seemed to me a bit childish, but I wasn't sure enough of myself to abandon it. Besides, the key was my last link to my sister, to the Kitty I remembered or imagined. Memory or imagination. Already I couldn't be sure at all that Kitty had ever existed. Only the key told me that she did. And the key had been lucky for us. Hadn't it brought us to Auntie Meg's all those years before? So I kept my key, and I'm glad I did. Very glad indeed. The last I saw of Auntie Meg, she was holding her straw hat on her head and standing there, disappearing in a cloud of dust left behind by the bus. For Marty and me, this was the first time we'd been on a bus since the day we first arrived in Australia 10 years before. Then we were leaving Sydney. Now we were back. As I remember, Marty said just about the same thing to me that he'd said then. We'll be all right. We sat silent the whole way, neither of us believing this was happening. Both of us knew that we were leaving our childhoods behind forever. It felt just like we were heading off into the bush again, into the unknown. Together we might have been, but each of us felt very alone on the journey. When I felt the tears welling inside me, I tried to cheer myself up by thinking of Henry's horrible hat hole, or trying to get an E-or out of Barnaby. But sooner or later I'd think of Auntie Meg's, and the moments that happened I'd be overwhelmed by sadness, a sadness that I'd never felt before, a sadness so painful it gnawed at my stomach. I've only got to think about her now, and I can still feel that same pang, faint perhaps now like a distant echo, but still there. That's how much I loved her. That's how much I loved our glowing time with her. There we go. Off on their big boys' journeys. Right, that's it for this week. Enjoy the weekend, and we will pick this up again on Monday. Bye for now.